Hello everyone, my name is Phawx. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing Anbernic's latest device, their RG Arc. It comes in two different versions, the S and the D. First, thank you very much to Anbernic for sending this device out to me for review. And thankfully, I've been able to get this review out before the pre-sale actually goes live. There's two different versions. Again, there's the D and the S. The S is a Linux version. There's no multi-touch on the device itself, and it only has 1 gig of RAM. The D version has multi-touch and 2 gigs of RAM. We're going to be touching base on the specs in just a moment, but for all intents and purposes, for my particular point of view, the S version, the $70 version, especially the pre-sale discount version, is probably all you really need. We'll touch base on a few other things. Android does feature better user experience insofar that you can touch the screen to get things done as opposed to needing to use just the D-pad as well as the buttons. But Linux is more than enough for the types of games that you're looking to run on here, especially the chipset that's on here. You're not going to be able to play a lot of heavy-duty games, especially there's going to be some Sega Saturn games that are going to be a little bit too demanding, especially some Sega Saturn games are going to demand a more accurate emulator, which will be far too demanding for the chipset to run. Likewise, there's going to be some games on N64, PSP, PS2, other higher-end emulation that is going to require far more CPU than this is going to deliver, both on Android or on Linux, and that difference in RAM really isn't going to help you. That difference in RAM is just to make really Android more usable and better to use. So it's not necessary for anything that you're going to be looking to run. So I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way first. But let's go ahead and take a look at the specs themselves. Some of the differences that I've already mentioned between the S and the D are already mentioned in the spec sheet. We'll go over them briefly here, but largely the difference between the S and the D comes down to three things. It comes down to a 1 gig of RAM difference. The Linux version only has 1 gig of RAM, whereas the Android has 2 gigs, and that's really necessary for Android just to be usable. The other difference that we're going to see here is the Linux version, or the S version, does not have a touchscreen. All of your inputs are going to be done through the D-pad and face buttons alone. If that's something that you think is going to be a miss for you and you'd rather have the user experience to be able to touch on the screen, you're going to have that Android version, which is only going to have that touchscreen on there. The last difference between these two versions is that the Linux version has no onboard NAND on the device itself, whereas the Android version already has Android loaded onto the 32 gigs of NAND on the device itself, which is separate from the microSD card slots that could be loaded on the bottom of the device. We touch more on that on the build quality section of this review. Fleshing it out, we have the 4-inch IPS 4x3 640x480 display, which is excellent for the types of games that are going to be playable on this device. Obviously, is because we have this 4x3 display. Aspect ratios are going to be something that you don't really have to muck around with too much and not have to change any of the settings. Also, because the Rockchip 3566 really isn't all that performant, we're in a place where we're not going to be able to run a lot of the high-end games. So that pretty much goes over what's on the spec list here. For what it's worth, Anbernic really just repackaged their 353P and put it into what they're calling the Arc. In fact, if we take a look at Geekbench, Anbernic has not renamed it, so it's still named the 353P. So for all intents and purposes, what you're looking at is a 353P that has been repackaged into something that is resembling the Sega Saturn Model 2 controller, which does have a lot of benefits, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. Getting onto the review proper here of Anbernic's latest RG Arc series, this is for all intents and purposes very similar to the RG353P. In fact, when we take a look at that Geekbench score, you can actually see that the model system that is on this device shows up as the 353P. So for all intents and purposes, we're going to have very similar performance that was on the 353P, so you should be gearing your expectations in that manner. For instance, while we can run a good amount of Sega Saturn games, there are going to be some that are just not playable, especially games that demand more accuracy. Those games are going to be very challenging to run. There will be a number of N64 games as well that will be challenging to run unless we sacrifice accuracy, as well as Dreamcast games are going to be not absolutely perfect. There are going to be some games where you're going to notice popping and hissing, like even in Soul Calibur. Before we get into the build quality part of this review, let's talk about size comparisons. And the one that I want to bring up here that I think is most apt is obviously the Anbernic RG353P. This device manages to pack in more, have additional analog sticks, and remains smaller overall. It's a pretty interesting design decision that Anbernic went with here to make the device overall larger. But having said that, I actually like having a wider device. It's just that I wanted to point this out so that people could pretty much understand what you're going to be getting into with this type of device, that it is going to sacrifice a fair bit of space as opposed to the RG353P. The last bit that I want to talk about before going into the build quality part of this review is obviously we've got to talk about this D-pad. For what it's worth, Anbernic did a fantastic job modeling over the Sega Saturn Model 2 controller. This is not the Sega Saturn Model 2 controller. This is the 8-bit-do version of the Sega Saturn Model 2. For what it's worth, 8-bit-do remains my first pick for third-party controller manufacturers. They do an absolute fantastic job out of pretty much every third-party console controller manufacturer that I've used. They have an eye towards authenticity while also like really just excelling and trying to make sure that these controls are as absolutely good as they possibly can be. That is for the SN30 Pro. This is for the M30 as well. Pretty much every controller that 8-bit-do has created, I am a big fan of. What we have over here is my original Sega Saturn controller. This is what came with my launch Sega Saturn. This is the Sega Saturn Model 1 controller. This is what came to the US on launch day. The Model 2 Sega Saturn came a little bit later, and the packaging on the box showed the Model 2 controller, the D-pad. For what it's worth, I love the Model 2 controller, but I also really love the Model 1 D-pad. This D-pad, I mean, I guess there's people that don't like it, but this giant concavity that they have right here and how it just fits the thumb, I don't know, but I absolutely love this D-pad. I'm not sure how you feel. Let me know in the comment section how you feel about the Model 1 Sega Saturn controller. I'm a big fan of it. Let's start talking about the build quality of the ARC series itself. So up first, we're looking at this D-pad, and much different from other Anbernic D-pads. Even though this adopts a Super Nintendo style D-pad, largely it still feels very similar to other Anbernic membrane-based D-pads. Whereas Anbernic is going with a completely different design here. This is going to be one of their first ones that I've seen that has this pivot structure, much like the Model 2 Sega Saturn D-pad is. Over here we have our face buttons. Now these face buttons are also membrane based, but they feel very nice. The face buttons themselves have a bit more springiness than the 8-bit-do as well as the Sega Saturn Model 1 controller. Sega Saturn Model 1 controller, especially how old this is, has given up the ghost a little bit, and they kind of depress in a bit of a different way. I actually like how these kind of spring back. They got a nice snap to them. Overall, face buttons are pretty easy. I'm never going to grade face buttons unless they're truly atrocious. These are overall really good. We do have stacked shoulders, which are great to see. I'm glad that Anbernic is slowly going away from inline shoulder buttons. We have a thin R1 and L1, as well as digital triggers that you can see right here. The design of the RG Arc is definitely in the digital realm. There is nothing analog about this. There are no analog sticks on it, and for what it's worth, I'm kind of glad that there aren't. The chipset that's on here really caters towards older retro games that are going to really be favoring the D-pad anyway, so overall the ergonomics and how everything feels in hand is designed as best as it possibly can for those types of games. If you wanted to play something that's going to be a little bit more 3D and need an analog stick, this is not the device for you. There's a lot of other devices, especially with the T618 chip, that are going to be a better choice. However, because of the price and the form factor, as well as the D-pad and the 6 face buttons, this offers something that I think a lot of people were pretty much interested in. Finishing it off at the top, we have our power button, volume, our function key, which acts as a back button in Android. We have our mini HDMI, our on-the-go USB-C port. This is where you can plug in adapters for USB, and then our DC plug port for USB-C right there. On the bottom is our 3.5mm audio jack, as well as the system card for the Linux part here, and then the ROM slot. So you have 2 microSD slots. This one is for the Linux slot. This one is for your storage. Then we have a little reset switch over here, as well as front-firing speakers. The one thing that's interesting that's different from all Anbernic devices is that we're missing the trademark rubber backs that all Anbernic devices always have, so that it would never slide around. And you can see that this one does. It's interesting that Anbernic decided to not have rubber backs this go round. Not that it really matters, but it's just a thing that I noticed. At this point, we're going to test out the D-pad, and for what it's worth, they really did an excellent job. Okay, so something that's already done on the Anbernic Arc series is that all of the face buttons are already configured like an arcade would be. So this is low punch, medium punch, and then fierce. So low, medium, don't hit me, medium, fierce, and likewise for kicks. So that's fierce kick, light kick, medium kick. So that's already pre-configured, which is nice. All right, I gotta get dragon punches for days here. So you can see that it's easy enough to do it from either side. it really is a fantastic D-pad. There is zero question. This is Anbernic's best D-pad that they've ever made yet, which is basically just copying Sega's best D-pad. So Anbernic's best D-pad, this is definitely just a copy of Sega Saturn D-pad, which is already a fantastic D-pad, right? I gotta end it with a Dragon Punch. Yeah, buddy. So yeah, this D-pad is without a doubt the best D-pad that Anbernic has ever made, or in this case, copied off of the Sega Saturn Model 2 D-pad. So this is what I think a lot of people are going to be looking forward to, is if they were looking at playing fighting games on a handheld. So that's my review on Anbernic's RG Arc. Now, when it comes down to the S or the D version, largely that's going to be up to you. Now, for all intents and purposes, I think the S version is just fine. And this is something that I always kind of say whenever I take a look at these devices, because I would try to look for the most cost-conscious version, because I'm very performance-minded. That extra gig of RAM that you're going to get on the D version isn't going to do anything really large for you performance-wise in any particular game. You need that extra gig of RAM just to have Android run comfortably and usable in any particular manner. So while the performance is going to be the same on the Rockchip 3566, you're not going to get anything from that extra gig of RAM. You do get multi-touch display and the 32 gigs of NAND storage, and that's really where that $20 difference is. So does $20 really make or break you on your decision? That will really be up to you to decide if you need the S or the D. Again, I think the Linux side is going to be just fine, but largely it's going to be up to you to make that decision. Overall, the problem with this particular device, as opposed to other devices out there, is that there are devices that are far more performant and don't cost all that much more. There are a bunch of different T618 chips, or some things that are adjacent to T618, which are way more performant than this. So you really have to look at it from an angle where you can even just do $10 more than the D version of this and get something that's a fair bit more performant. So you really have to really decide on what you're looking for out of this model. And all of that should be dictated based on the copy of the D-pad from the Sega Saturn Model 2 controller, with also the 6 face buttons here. This is something that is going to be really beneficial for arcade games as well as fighting games in general. Overall, this is probably Anbernic's best D-pad that they have available to them, and just copying Sega Saturn's Model 2 controller was all they needed to do. It is a fantastic D-pad, and in my opinion, Anbernic's best D-pad out of all their devices to date. So you really have to kind of decide on it from your angle where you want this from, because the biggest selling point here is the D-pad and the 6 face buttons. It's not performance, and it's not price, because price-wise, especially if you've already bought a 3566 device, you're not really going to get much more than that. So that's really what it boils down to. Yeah, it's really cool and awesome. I'm glad that Anbernic did this. Largely, I think that this is already going to be sufficient enough to what it really needs to do, because there are no analog sticks on this, and it doesn't really need to do anything more than what is already on offer. So anyway, I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.